All right, we're talking coaching and mentoring with Joe Amplo. I'm Chris Vaccaro. Coach Amplo is the head men's lacrosse coach at the Naval Academy. Formerly was at Marquette. He was at Hofstra. He's a fellow Hofstra and Sachem alum like myself. Thanks for joining me to talk about your life and career.
Always a pleasure, Chris, to be with you. Thanks for asking.
And we've talked about some of these things in the past, obviously, as I, endlessly talk to people who went to Sachem making an impact. But this is specific about your role and your path to coaching. So, did you grow up wanting to be a coach and a mentor? Did you want to make an impact on people's lives from an early age? How did you sort of get that bug to make this a lifelong journey?
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about this, and I'll tell the stories again. I grew up wanting to be a high school teacher and coach. Because the greatest influences on my life were my middle school coaches and high school coaches, and I wanted to be just like those guys. And have an impact on young people the way that they impacted me. That's what I wanted my life's work to be. So when I went to college, I was in education and thought I would was destined for a history or social studies classroom and coaching football and lacrosse and doing those things. That's kind of how I envisioned my life. But then I had an opportunity to work in college right out of school, and I fell in love with that. Just the full-time aspect of it and the more robust impact that you can have on students and people in an impactful time in their lives. So, I tried to work my way through the college coaching game.
And when you're a kid, when you're being impacted by your high school coaches, and you say, "Oh yeah, I'd like to do this. I think this makes sense. I want to be in this setting." Obviously, you had a very good sort of upbringing at Sachem with Fred Fasaro and Rick Mercurio and all their great assistants. Then you go to Hofstra and you have John Danowski, and you had this sort of great pillars of industry. But not until you start coaching do you really get that juice flowing, that understanding of you're impacting student athletes. At what point did you say, wow, not only was it an idea, but this is something I want to do because I'm living it and I'm breathing it?
It was probably early on in my Hofstra experience as a coach. At that time, I was coaching some guys who I had played with, and the respect that they gave me made an impact on me because I was seen as a leader, and I appreciated that. And they also appreciated the instruction I was giving, but it was more than just on the field. And to me, the leadership that I'm always after is the impact you can make on a person personally. I think that helps you on the field. So I've always been a relationship based coach and really strive to make the deepest connection I can with an individual and a group. Because I think whatever strategy in any sport, in any organization, you're trying to get across, the relationship, the trust that's formed is always going to make that situation better. So at that time, early on, maybe because I was friends with some of the guys and had known them personally, it was easy for me to see that side of it, right? So they would come to me for things that were off the field because I was younger, right? Maybe more approachable. And as I got older in the business and started to coach guys that I didn't know and recruited and knew through that, I always went back to the relationship piece being at the forefront of whatever I did.
So you've mentioned the word respect, leadership, relationships. You've developed a philosophy, a method of there's coaching and there's mentoring, and I want to talk about both. But at what point did you start to feel comfortable with your philosophy as someone who can relate to others?
I went for my degree in counseling for my master's at Hofstra. And I did it because John Danowski, who's my mentor, he was the head coach at Hofstra, and I worked for him and with him for 6 years. And then again, later on in my life with the USA team, he said, "You're an educator." So like most young coaches, you would assume if there's a master's degree they're going to chase, it's like a phys ed or something along those lines. To me, I wanted to figure out the strategies to get to know people and have kids chase vulnerability and give me the tool set or the toolkit to reach guys on an interpersonal level. So I started to realize that there's a philosophy around it. And for me, like my philosophy has always been based in the relationship part, but I've got three goals with every relationship I have and every team I've coached. It's my job is to have them, like me, have an impact on how they think, how they act, and how they feel. To me, that's how I live my life. That's how I look at every interaction I have. I'm trying to figure out what's going on in their life, where they need support, where they need a push, maybe a hug or a kick in the right direction, because I think that just leads to just greater successes, greater impact, and more long-standing impact, right? To me, I want sustainability. It's not just the short-term success of trying to get that week's strategy or that play or that technique down. It's, can my impact have sustainment and impact how they think, how they act, and how they feel when they're not around me, and when they go into the world and do the things that great men do.
Do you find yourself mentoring more than coaching? And I mean by coaching, I see that as X's and O's, strategy, tactics on the field. The rest of the time, you're doing exactly what you're explaining, the interpersonal relationship you're building, the culture you're defining with your locker room. Is there a percentage difference here? And how much of it, do you break down based on your own profession of this is my day, here's how I'm making an impact? Like, how do you break that all down?
I talk about this all the time in recruiting. It's, to me, like the most fun I have is in the office with a young man, or in an intimate setting, or a random encounter, when you're bumping into them on campus, or when they call you, outside of a lacrosse setting. To me, that's where we do our greatest work. But to answer your question of what the ratio is, I would argue it's probably 2 to 1, in the sense that, and maybe even more, Chris, honestly. I might be doing more mentoring, loving, caring, motivating than the tactical stuff. And I'm blessed to have great assistants where they can handle a lot of the tactical stuff, and I can do some more higher level culture type work and really dive into that, because the pulse of the team, the the feeling of the group, the experience of the individuals. That's my job as the leader, to make sure that we're all going in the right direction, and we are all in sync with whatever strategy we're trying to get across.
Do you have a specific style? Would you define your style as any specific type of coach or mentor? Do you think about leadership style and strategy in that way?
Yeah, I mean, my leadership style I try and chase is being a servant leader. I say this to kids all the time. I'm here to serve them, and we truly are here to serve the players. And John Danowski told me this, like, it's the players' team, right? And we serve them. And when really, when we're chasing leadership, I think great teams, the number one indicator for a great team or any organization is one of empowerment. When the people, for us, it's the players. For organizations outside of sport, it's the workers. When they're empowered to live their way, live a principled life based on the principles of that organization, and that drives their behavior. That's empowerment. But I think you see that when, for us, it's not coach fed, we say it's player led. When the players are empowered to lead that way, and they're driving that culture, whatever it is that you define, whatever the behaviors are that a team or an organization are chasing, right? The players or the people should be driving that behavior. If it's always the upper level management in an organization trying to lead from the top down, or the coaches trying to lead from the top down, I don't think you're going to really access the true potential of that group. So for us, we work on that, trying to develop what leadership looks like, certainly setting that example and holding accountable. But at some point, you hope it's early on in your time with a team, the players need to take over, and then we're just there to guide the ship. You don't get to that point every year. I think it's a really tough thing to truly get to, but that's really what we chase, that empowerment and that player-led environment that I think makes great teams great.
And you're referencing John Danowski. If the average person that will watch this or listen to this doesn't understand, he's one of the greatest coaches of all time, obviously in lacrosse, but arguably any sport. The Team USA coach, the Duke coach. He was the Hofstra coach for many years. Um, Everything you're talking about goes beyond the fact that you're coaching at a service academy. So you would be saying this even when you were at Marquette. He's saying this and feeling this even at Duke. But my question actually relates to the service academy. Is there a heightened sense of culture and leadership and tactics about how to create the next generation of great leaders, even in your lacrosse locker room, because you're at a service academy?
Yes, and to me, that's the responsibility I feel and why I'm so blessed to be here, right? Because whatever leadership, philosophy, environment, skills I can relate to these young men, then the hope is that it serves them in their greater mission, right? It gives them tools so that when they're leading men and women, hopefully not in combat, but in really tough situations and challenging environments, they can relate back to their experiences in the lacrosse field, on the locker room, in those intimate moments in between the big moments from a lacrosse standpoint, they can relate back to that. So for them, trust is always number one. How do you establish trust? Right? How do you develop a relationship so that you can establish trust? Right? So that you can be seen as that leader that is reliable, right? And dependable. And also how they create an environment within their friendships, within their small teams that is welcoming, and there's this comfort and this safety, right? We talk about belonging, and having kids feel safe in an environment is the first step to that trust. If a kid doesn't feel safe in our environment, then he's never going to be able to be himself. If he's never able to be himself, then we're never going to get to the true root of who he is and what he needs. So we work on those strategies and what that looks like to create that safety, and then we push on the leadership to try and hold kids accountable to a standard that we create. And that's true if we have a Marine officer who just graduated and he's going to be leading 40 Marines in the next 6 months. He's going to need that. He's going to need the understanding of, I've got 40 new people who come from different backgrounds who need to come and operate as one of the world's greatest teams. So he's got to create that environment of safety first. And then he's got to figure out what his standard is and hold accountable to them that standard. And at some point, he's going to need his young Marines to feel empowered that they can drive that standard and the behaviors that need to be exhibited so that they can complete the mission, whatever it is. So there's no, it's the same in any organization. Whether you're leading a group of Marines or sailors, or you're trying to build a lacrosse team, right? You're trying to have a group of people believe in what that organization stands for, understand it, and have that drive their behavior on a daily basis.
Do you find yourself mentioning those military references when you're coaching and mentoring and guiding? Does that come into your culture?
For me, it doesn't, because the obvious thing is where I'm at, right? I'm at the United States Naval Academy, and I wasn't in the armed forces. I'm just blessed to work here. So for me to use those references too often, I think it would seem less authentic, right? Certainly there's moments where I can grab stories from people who have told me, but it's secondhand, right? And if I walked in every conversation I'm leading like a military leader, then they're going to see right through me. I have to be myself. I have to be vulnerable enough to know that I don't know everything. And, part of their world, most of their world, I am the most ignorant person, and I think that, to me, that was my first line of creating trust is, hey, I don't know what you're going through when you're over in Bancroft Hall, which is our dormitory. I don't know what life is like as a midshipman. Why don't you tell me? Why don't you tell me what it's like? What challenges do you find? What choices are you trying to make as you're choosing your service, and why? Right? And that opens up conversations and gives me clues into what these kids need, what they're going through, and how I can either push the gas pedal or hold back a little bit on how hard I need to be on these kids.
Has there been a situation where, we're talking a lot about positivity and pushing in the right direction, but where you've actually learned, wow, that was a bad move, that was bad advice, I learned that I shouldn't do that as a coach? Where have been the pitfalls? It's not easy. It's not some easy profession. You didn't get to this position, especially at the Naval Academy, without learning a lot about yourself and going through your own challenges to get there. So where have been the pitfalls that you've overcome?
Yeah, I think I'm like here. I'm learning. I went away from who I was as a coach when I first got here, um, because I don't want to say I gave this institution too much credit, but I didn't realize that the young men on my team wanted a demanding leader. I thought because I'm at a demanding institution where there's so much stress and challenge and so much demand on their time and their expectations and their behavior outside of lacrosse, that lacrosse should only be fun. right? And to me, as a leader, I need to be demanding and I need to press on the standards. The standard is the standard for us. So hard work and the things that make up, really good teams and tough lacrosse teams, I've always been about, and I was less about my first couple of years here. I've gotten slowly back to that, and I think that's helped us climb back up the success ladder from a competition standpoint.
Do you go back to, your prep days, you're playing in high school and college, where there were specific moments that you recall all these years later with a Fred Fasaro, Rick Mercurio, John Danowski, where they're mentoring you and you remember those lessons? And do you still impart some of those lessons to your players today? Anything very specific that comes to mind? And they could be wild moments and crazy stories. I mean, all the stories from Sachem and Hofstra in those days were old school, blue collar. Like, I know
Yeah.
what those guys were like.
Yeah, I'll give you, I mean, one that wasn't even on the field, and it's probably the most powerful, impactful moment maybe of my life was, and I think I've said this to you before, when my grandmother passed away when I was a junior in high school, who I was very close to. And I remember being at the wake, for her, and Fred Fusaro walked in the door. And I literally was playing for him for 3 weeks. And he was a legend for us in our town. And I always dreamed about playing for him. Finally made the varsity. And 3 weeks into varsity football, my grandmother passes away. I'm still a kid. He probably didn't even know my name. And he walks into the wake. And I remember the warmth that I felt in that moment. And at that moment, I said, I will do anything for this man, right? Because he took the time out of his day to come pay his respects to my family. And to me, that was the moment I knew that coaching was absolutely what I wanted to do. And, the most powerful moment that a coach had on me was not on the field. And I do believe that's why I look at all those other moments to try and be there for these young men, right? Because, I had that feeling that I would do anything on the football field for Fred because he was there for me when I needed them most, or I didn't know what I needed. I was a young, immature kid, right? But it turns out I needed this older guy who I revered to just come in there and give me a hug and pay his respects to my family.
And you're around Coach Janowski to this day, obviously coaching with him from Team USA and other guys like Seth Tierney, the Hofstra head coach today. These are people that are great to have in your corner, great to run things by. Do you find yourself still asking for advice or saying, "Hey, how would you handle this?" from the older statesmen that have been there just a bit longer than you?
Yeah, all the time. I mean, I talk to John Danowski every day, and we'll share stories on our teams. And we usually talk about books all the time. We just finished a great book together, The Power of Moments, which is an excellent one if you haven't read it. Um, he's there for me no matter what. And, and a lot of times he's asking questions, which to me, I think is so it's beautiful as a leader, right? He's been in our sport for 30 years, and he's the winningest coach in our sport. 2 gold medals, 3 national championships. But he's asking me questions, right? And I think that's a great expression of servant leadership. It's an expression of really developing, how the relationship has been developed, where he respects what I have to say, he's interested in what I have to say, and that's a reminder for me that listening is probably always more important than speaking, you know, and trying to hear what other people need is a skill that I think a lot of people forget about. But for him, our conversations are always like that.
You mentioned reading books together and listening to the older folks around you. Do you go to conferences? Do you read books on leadership? Do you read books by other coaches? How are you tactfully becoming a better coach besides just living your experiences and evolving?
Yeah, through the summer, and I always read leadership books in the summer. Sometimes I read too much, and I try and reinvent myself. I have to remember that you just got to keep it simple. So it seems I'm always reading 4 or 5 different books at once. But right now, I'm trying just to be really isolated on one at a time and pull 1 or 2 things out of it and relate it back to what my core philosophy is. Of being that servant leader and trying to create empowerment within my team. So I'll pull a strategy or a story or an anecdote out of a book and utilize it and not try and recreate myself every single time I turn the page of a book. You know, I think there's consistency in a lot of the stuff you read in leadership. I think you can pull certain strategies and they may be described in a different way, but there's consistency. Admiral McCraven in his latest book, The Wisdom of the Bullfrog, he says leadership is difficult, but it's easy, right? It's easy in the sense that it's pretty simple. Like anybody can say, yes, that's the right thing to do in that moment, but then going to do it, right, is difficult. Holding a kid accountable for something is difficult. It's obvious what should be done, but taking that action is the difficult thing. Um, so, so yeah, I think it's the responsibility of coaches as leaders to be lifelong learners, to be just wildly curious, but not overwhelm yourself, and always relate back to the fact that you probably know what you're doing, right? But you just need a little bit more refresher sometimes to help you do it maybe better or new and keep it vibrant.
Society continues to evolve. We're in a different point where young adults may not act the same way they were when you were in college, when I was in college. I see this as a professor. The accountability, the standards, they're just different for various reasons. Do you see that impacting your world? Do you have to relate in this interpersonal way to young adults as well? I mean, I'm wondering if it's slightly different because you're at a service academy, but still, do you find the young adult evolving as society has evolved in your career?
Yeah, I do see that. I don't think it's different here, Chris. I think that was again one of the things I learned where these are still just 18-year-old kids, right? And they're still immature and they don't know everything. I think, the biggest influence, obviously, for all of us is the influence of social media, and everybody has eyes on these young men, and there is this like culture, where you want that positive affirmation. So I think you've got to use that. You have to live their world a little bit more than we used to, because kids need that positive reinforcement that they're doing a good job. So I've found myself trying to be a little bit more positive and find some highlights in whatever realm. It could be a kid, studying in the office, right, and really celebrating those little moments and having that kid feel prideful that I've noticed him working on schoolwork when he normally wouldn't. To me, that's as good as if he posted something on Instagram and someone made a comment about it, right? So I think giving kids that reinforcement is important. It makes them feel seen, right? And my job as a coach is to make them feel uniquely seen, right? It's not cookie cutter with every kid. Every kid has a uniqueness about them, and there's specific needs and things that motivate them. So our job as leaders is to make them feel uniquely seen, right? So we've got to really do a good job of figuring out what it is about a kid that he needs in order to feel his best.
And part of this conversation is obviously academic research and relating it to coaching and mentoring broadly, not just actual professional coaches in the sports world. Do you see parallels or differences with a coach who goes into a corporation in a business and tries to coach, employee X, Y, and Z in some industry versus what you're doing? Is there parallel natures of a coach as a coach? And have you ever, dipped your toes into that corporate world as trying to motivate people because you have a really good fundamental understanding of how to be a coach? Has that ever popped up?
I've done some speaking engagements with corporations, and I relate them to the speaking engagements that we have where people come into our environment, where they're great singular moments, but I don't think they make a terrific impact, because I think the great impact is when there's long time engagement, right? Because there's a relationship built up, right? Um, for me, sure, I can go and talk about my leadership style and the strategies that I use here. Some strategies won't work on another team, in another environment. Some strategies may work in a corporation, but at the root of it, if there's relationship that's built up, there's trust that's created, there's safety, then you've got a chance to get to a place of empowerment, right? There's got to be a standard set and principles that you rely on that are kind of your guiding light or your Alamo that you go back to, and then behaviors need to be identified. right? What are the behaviors in an organization? If I walked into a corporation and sat in a boardroom and spoke to a leadership group about behaviors in their environment, it would be it would be disingenuous because I don't know what behaviors are necessary, right? But I can talk about you need to develop relationships in a meaningful way. You need to set principles that are meaningful to your corporation and behaviors that represent those principles and then drive on that. You know, we say leadership drives culture, the culture drives behavior, behavior drives results. That's the performance pathway, right? And that's how we look at it. You know, and great corporations, the leadership is driven by the people. Great teams, it's driven by the players. Teams that are trying to become great, it's driven by the coaches, right? So this year we want to get to a place where our players are driving that culture. They understand what it means to be a Navy lacrosse player. They exhibit the behaviors that our principles suggest, right? If people come into our environment, the hope is that you would say those kids are bold, there's accountability, they're together, and they do everything with love. And I would say, well, why? And if they give us the behaviors that we want to represent, then I would feel like our culture is strong, right? Those are the things that, you know, I can talk about here. Now, you may listen to me speak in a boardroom and I can say those things, but for me to have an impact on that corporation, I would have to be there for a long time, right? I would have to observe and try and see what behaviors exist. Where's the consistency? What are the relationships like, right? Where is their safety? Where is there not?
And I've been involved in this in the corporate setting where there's hired coaches, and even that long-standing relationship always has a breakdown because they don't work for the company. And it depends on the culture. And I'm glad you even got to culture as one of the next things that I wanted to talk about. And creating an environment where there is coaching is one step. If you come into the environment, you don't know the key players and the stakeholders and the drama and the toxicity. No matter how great an organization is, there's always a piece of drama that could be dictating some outcome. And one of those areas I've seen and been involved with is the coaching. And you said the word, there's this disingenuous relationship that forms where you're just being told what to do by a coach, but that coach doesn't really know who you are. And even if they're there once a week, once a month for a year, they still don't understand all the nuances of a company or a team or an organization. So it's really difficult unless there's a hired person like yourself who's a coach that's meant to be there to help build the culture and lead the people. You almost can never have perfect coaching. And culture, which I want to ask about, is not also built in a day or even sometimes a season. And you've said you've evolved. Your program is probably evolving because of your evolution and even figuring out yourself. How are you building that culture? How are you relying on the people around you as the other stakeholders involved in both the Navy athletic program, but also the Navy lacrosse program? How do you define your culture? Do you do it in series of meetings, in a series of conversations? And then how is that impacting the entire, your journey, your day, everything?
Yeah, it drives us. Honestly, I say it's our greatest strategy, and culture has to be a strategy that drives behavior. And first, it's got to be defined. Like, what do you want to stand for, right? And we did a lot of work on this the first few years I was here. We did it, we redid it, and then 2 years ago, we settled on it, and we included the team because if I wanted empowerment and player-led behavior, then I needed to include them and listen to them. It took us 6 months to get to what we landed on in the four principles of bold, accountable, together, love. And it's an acronym we spell battle, right? And for us, it's meaningful, right? Battle certainly has a connection to where we are, you know. And then it's spaced repetition. You need to make sure that you are spacing it out along the whatever continuum you're on, right? For us, we will have a weekly meeting that is just on culture, right? And it may be a 10-minute meeting, but it is each week. And then each day, there has to be signs of that culture that exist. So it needs to be branded in different ways. Some is visual, right? They need to see it. They need to literally see the words, see the behaviors, understand it. Some is auditory. They need to hear it, right? So for us, we always break down our huddles with battle. right? And we always go left hand in because it's closest to the heart, and we go 3-2-1 instead of 1-2-3 because we want to be one. We don't want to be third, right? So to us, it's a little thing that makes a big difference. It's spaced over time. They're always hearing the words battle, and then we have battle targets. Those are our goals, right? So we're not just saying, hey, these are our goals. These are our battle targets. It relates back to the culture, right? And the battle targets are goals, and then there's battle plays where we're going to celebrate moments within our game that signify culture. So we'll have a play that shows accountability, or a play that shows love. It could be a celebration, or a kid who scores a goal is always going to go point to, the guy who threw the ball to him, right? That's an expression of love. Or we're going to show a video of the sideline, how they celebrated, right? How a kid who doesn't play in a game is the most energized, great body language on the sideline. That's an expression of love. A bold play for us is when a kid does something he normally wouldn't do. We've been trying to get him to do it. He shows this expression of vulnerability. So we're going to make that a bold play, right? So trying to attach moments that make a difference in whatever success you're chasing and tie them back to your culture. So it's little reminders spaced over time, right? And you're always talking about it. You're celebrating those moments. And that's where the culture becomes ingrained in the organization.
Incredible. We may have talked many, many times over the years, but this is deep on your philosophies. This is why I wanted to chat. Last question, advice for people going into coaching, for people that, again, in that period of their life saying, yeah, I want to be involved in sports. This makes a lot of sense to me, but they just don't know yet what they're getting involved in. What's the main advice you would give them?
I would say talk to as many people as you can, but mostly talk to the people you're most afraid to speak to. You know, don't be afraid to pick the phone up, write the letter or the email to like the scariest person. I'll give you an example. Like Bill Belichick is a big figure here. His dad coached at the Naval Academy for years. A couple of years ago, he was given the key to the city of Annapolis, and they did it before our Army Navy game. So I had the great honor of meeting him, and we had a great conversation. He spoke to our team before the game. I could have left that relationship as it was. A great moment for me, great moment for our team. And hey, I met Bill Belichick, right? Well, I wrote him a note afterwards, thanked him. He wrote me a note back. He sent me an email and said, if you ever need anything, give me a call. I can tell you that at least 3 times last year, I called Bill Belichick and asked him advice on culture strategy, and messaging on my team, right? Was I nervous as can be to make that phone call the first time? Absolutely. But great coaches are educators, they're teachers, they're mentors at their core, you know, and there's a willingness to help. And there may be some people who don't pick the phone up, but there are those that will, right? And I'm not saying Bill Belichick is going to answer everybody's phone call, but it was that one small encounter that I had with arguably the greatest coach on the planet that I said, screw it. Why wouldn't I? Why wouldn't I make this tough phone call to see if I can get some knowledge from this great man? So I would say ask as many questions, talk to as many people, and be vulnerable enough to shoot your shot and try.
Awesome. Appreciate the time, the wisdom, the philosophy, and thanks as always for sharing your input and your life story.
Yeah, man. Appreciate you always. Thanks, Chris.